So let's move to containment. This is a new policy that Truman took the advice of many of his advisors in deciding to contain communism. The thought was you can't stop it where it's at without causing a war, but maybe you could contain it, meaning keep it where it is located, keep it where it's at, and not let it expand. The thought was, again, if you let communism expand, then it would grow, and it would continue to flourish and influence other countries. And if it did not grow, it would eventually die out. This policy was introduced by George Kennan. That is an important name, George Kennan, and would really dictate U.S. policy concerning communism for decades to come. This is also when the term Cold War was coined by journalist Walter Lippmann. And the Cold War again kind of stuck post 1948, 49 ish, something like that, all the way till 1991. Many felt that containment was a better reaction to communism than what happened in Munich in 1838, which was appeasement. And obviously, clearly, that did not work out as much as it should. The Truman Doctrine itself, the first implementation of the containment policy in response to two different threats. The communists were leading an uprising in Greece, and the Soviets demanded for some control over a water route in the area of Turkey. And so we're going to see real quickly what Truman's going to do about this. So, in order to fight the communists, here's what he did. He asked Congress for $400 million in economic and military aid in both countries to combat totalitarian regimes. And fortunately for him, and fortunately for those areas of Turkey and Greece, a bipartisan Congress agreed to lend aid to these areas. Now, notice we did not go into Russia. We went into Turkey, a place that was already free and democratic that was about to be taken by the communists, and we made sure that the communists could not fight them there. And it did work, but what we're doing is we're setting a precedent that anytime communism wants to expand, we send people out there and we decide that we are going to throw money at the situation and some military and hope that it works out. The next big part of the post-war policy was Marshall Plan. Europe was not recovering as fast as many had hoped. Remember, they're trying to get it to not have what happened post World War I, where Germany goes into all sorts of debt and is just a huge mess. And so many countries were short on food and massively in debt. Many feared that this would propel many countries to run to the communists, as they had a plan to try to, quote unquote, fix everything, as well as they were closer than America was. George Marshall outlined a program that would bring massive economic aid to Europe and help strengthen their democratic governments. Now, George Marshall, that name might look familiar. He was the main general, like the top dog in World War II. And so that's why that name should look familiar to you. Anyway, the program that would bring massive economic aid to Europe and help strengthen their democratic governments. The $17 billion plan, although it only ended up being $12 billion, you're like, oh man, only $12 billion. Yeah, exactly. Program was called the European Recovery Program, but many just called it the Marshall Plan because he came up with it. The U.S. even offered money to Russia, but they refused to take it. Any guesses why they refused to take it? I'm letting you guess right now. Letting you guess. Yeah, exactly. If you take money from the capitalist regime, what that means is that you aren't very good at what you're doing, and your country needs help from the capitalists, and that would make the communists look incredibly weak. The results worked as well as any could have hoped for. By the 1950s, the Western Europe had achieved self-sustaining growth, and any real threat of communism in that area was squelched. However, the rift between non-communist West and communist East grew bigger. You might be like, what do we mean by West? We're talking like Spain, we're talking about France, we're talking about England, we're talking about the Netherlands, Denmark. On the eastern side, we're talking, and Western Germany, I guess. And then on the eastern side, we're talking about Eastern Germany, Poland, Belarus, those countries there. And that leads us to the Berlin airlift in 1948. See, the Soviets had actually cut off all access by land to Berlin. Now, remember, if you can remember correctly, Berlin was split in half. But Berlin is on the eastern side. It's in eastern Germany, which was the communistic side. But even Berlin was split in half. They had routes that would go in and out of Berlin exclusively But Truman had refused to just leave Berlin all to the communists. And so Truman also rejected using force to open up the roads through the Soviet-controlled eastern zone to get supplies to the people in western Berlin. So almost picture Berlin as like a microcosm of Germany. So Germany had Western Germany, which is free, Eastern Germany, which is communistic. Berlin, which was set on the eastern side, was split in half as well. Western Berlin was free, Eastern Berlin was communistic. So, in order to get these people supplies, he decided to order U.S. planes to fly supplies to the people of West Berlin. For several months, U.S. bombers dropped aid to those in Western Berlin. Many were waiting for Stalin to challenge this measure by Truman, and he never did challenge him. And Truman looked like a hero. This is part of the reason for his victory in the 1948 election. He continued to give supplies to people who were in need. And Stalin, again, wasn't about to shoot down these planes, because you shoot down these planes and World War III is about to happen. And he was able to get supplies, and eventually, by 1949, the Soviets finally opened up the highways to Berlin, thus breaking their 11-month blockade. 11 months. A long-term consequence was the creation of two Germanys: the Federal Republic of Germany, which was Western German, and the German Democratic Republic, which is the Eastern Germany, run by as a Soviet satellite. And so if you guys look from 1949 moving forward to about 1990, you look at the Olympic records, you look at different things. You had Western Germany and you had Eastern Germany. And that was just basically like a symbol of what was going on post-World War and talking about the Iron Curtain itself. NATO and the national security. Truman broke the tradition of permanent alliances with European nations. In 1949, the U.S. was set to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, along with 10 other nations. Eisenhower was chosen as NATO's first commander. U.S. troops were now going to be stationed in Western Europe to deter against Russian aggression. North Atlantic Treaty Organization would have been like us, Canada, France, England, Northern Ireland, Denmark, those countries, and then again we would kind of work together. So it's kind of like a smaller version of the UN, but in an exclusive area. The goal was to create a military alliance for defending all members from outside attack. Not should be from outside attack. The Soviets copied this plan and created their own alliance for Eastern Europe. This would be called the Warsaw Pact. Hopefully you guys are kind of getting this, that when one country did one thing, another country did another. And so we kind of tried to mirror each other because we were trying to keep up with each other. The National Security Act in 1947, the U.S. began to modernize its military capability. This act would do the following. And think about it like this. We would centralize the Department of Defense, replacing it with the War Department. We used to call it the War Department until 1947. That lasted a long time. And now we called it the Defense Department, to coordinate operations for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Now, the Air Force was pretty new. The Air Force wasn't created till right around this time. It was just all under the auspice of Army or Navy. And so this essentially created the Air Force. It also created the National Security Council to coordinate foreign policy. This would be like those people that all sit down in a huge room with the president and talk to him about what we should do. And it also created the CIA, my favorite organization of all time, the Central Intelligence Agency, to employ spies to gather information on foreign governments. And so the CIA is one of the coolest organizations out there. It gathers information secretly and sometimes not so secretly. But they would deal with that. And they would employ spies to gather information on foreign investments. And then number two, the Selective Service System and Peacetime Draft were instituted. And so basically meaning a mandate where you had to send in your name regardless every time. Whenever you turned 18, you sent in your name, and they would have it for a database for a long time. That's the National Security Act. So basically what it did is it kind of created what we would consider the modern-day defense systems. And now moving on to, lastly for today, the atomic weapons. Post the Berlin crisis, scientists from both sides were in an intense competition to develop superior weapons. Obviously, we had the atomic bomb, but they're trying to go a little bit further. From 1945 to 1949, the U.S. was the only nation to have an atomic bomb. The U.S. also developed a new generation of long-range bombers for delivering long-range bombs. When you think of the bombers in 1940s, they basically had to fly over and just drop a whole bunch of bombs. But now we're trying to create stuff where we could drop them and shoot them down at the locations on the ground, long distance. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. So they're about 4 or 5 years behind us. As a result, Truman approved the development of a bomb a thousand times more powerful than the actual atomic bomb. And by 1952, the bomb was added to the U.S. arsenal. That would have been the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb is created, and then what's crazy is by 1953, the Russians create their own hydrogen bomb. This hydrogen bomb would have had higher heat. It would have had a larger range of destruction. It was pretty bad. In 1950, in a secret report known as NSC 68, it was recommended, would have been National Security Council 68, it was recommended that the following measures be taken in fighting the Cold War. Quadruple spending on national defense, meaning 20% of our gross national product, 20% of the products that we create actually end up going to national defense. We form alliances with non-communist countries around the world. And then we convince the public that an arms buildup was necessary for our defense. This is a very Republican mindset. This is a mindset of fear where we build up, and if we build up, then of course they're going to build up. And that's kind of what this was all about, is trying to get who could keep one-upping each other, and that would deal with us fighting them. And this is why it was kind of a war of words, threats, and policies. We just continued to say we could have this stuff and we could use it, but we're just not sure when and if we will. All right, we'll stop there. We'll talk about Cold War Asia later.